Hi, everyone. I'm Ajahn Sujato, and we're joining you again today for the second in a series of 4 classes, looking at the early Buddhist texts from a dialectical point of view. So looking at it in terms of a conversation. Now, hopefully, most of you were here last week. And so I won't go over all of the things that I went over last week. But just briefly to recap, we looked last week at the Dhanaya Sutta at Sutta Nipata number 1.2. And in the Dhanaya Sutta, we found that there is a the main narrative or the surface narrative is about a wealthy rancher who had security from material things. And the Buddha said there's no security from material things. And then it ended up being a conversion narrative. And we found that there was also a second layer of that, where the conversion narrative was given much more meaning and depth when we understood that he was also someone who was practicing his Vedic religion, doing his fire worship. And so we could see that not only was it about material security, but it was about spiritual security as well, and about how those two things are linked. And so we had... so one of the things that I want to try to share in this series of talks is the idea that when we look at what the suttas say from a dialectical point of view, then we gain a richness and a new dimension, which will let us see things with like a little bit more of a 3D perspective on them. Now, today we're going to be looking at the Majjhima Nikaya number 7, the Vata Sutta, or the Vatthupama Sutta. This is a very sort of classic, almost introductory sutta. And this sutta has quite a different structure than the Dhanaya Sutta. In this one, we have basically a straightforward Buddhist introduction, and then the second part of it is a conversation with the Brahman. So that conversation with the Brahman sort of interrupts almost a bit randomly during the course of the discourse. So one of the things I wanted to mention for today is that, how do I put this? When I'm looking at the different discourses in light of their context and so on, I'm not trying really to push any particular theory about this, except for the fact that I think it's interesting to do, and I think it's rewarding to do. And there's been a kind of a lot of different theories about the relationship between Buddhism and Brahmanism and so on and so forth. And my own perspective on that, if anybody's interested, is fairly boring and mainstream. I think that the Brahmins and the Jains were around before the Buddha. I think we have certain texts that pertain to that period before the Buddha. And I think the Buddha responded to them and lived with them and so on. There are some people who try to argue that the Buddha was teaching the same thing as we find in the Upanishads. And I find that I don't agree with that. I think that the Buddha clearly was accepting some things and rejecting other things. There are other people who say the Buddha wasn't aware of the profound teachings in the Upanishads, perhaps because they were composed later. Again, I disagree with this. I think that there's abundant evidence that the Buddha was well aware of what the Upanishads were teaching. And so I think that there's been a variety of, how do I put this, creative theories about this period and about the relationship. But, my own perspective is a fairly boring one, I have to admit. And so I'm sort of more looking into sort of trying to illuminate the ways in which the Buddha responded to these things. So for today's sutta, the Majjhima 7, the Vatthupama Sutta, or the Vata Sutta, let us begin, and let us... let me begin by doing some screen sharing. So I have heard, at one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in... Oh, sorry, by the way, before I start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an intro to Sutta Central, because sometimes I take these things for granted. Let's go to the home on Sutta Central. Here's our home page, suttacentral.net. It's very pretty. Okay, then we want to look at a sutta. So we go to the basket of discourses. We look in the middle discourses. So we can go here. And the top one is the Majjhima Nikaya. We can go straight to the full list of suttas here, or we can go through the list. verse 50, and different chapters. And each chapter has a summary, so you can sort of maintain your awareness of where you're going through the collections. And notice that as we go, we also have the breadcrumbs menu here. So this is keeping track of where we are in the midst of all of these things. Finally, we come to the list of suttas, and here we have what we call a suttaplex. And suttaplex is a complex of information about the sutta, and it has different translations. It has a root text, translations in other languages. So for this one, here's the list of other languages. My goodness, quite a lot, isn't it? And also various parallels. So we have a number of parallels here in Chinese. And if you look at these little arrows, these will distinguish a full parallel. That means it's more or less the same sutta, but just a bit different. And then this one is called a resembling parallel, which means that there's something similar, maybe some passage or some idea or something like that. And you can see the arrows are a bit different, so they will tell you what kind of parallel there are. Okay, and then we can go here to the text itself. All right, fine. So I have heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. There, the Buddha addressed the mendicants. Mendicants, venerable sir, they replied. The Buddha said this. Suppose, mendicants, there was a cloth that was dirty and soiled. No matter what dye the dyer applied, whether blue or yellow or red or magenta, it would look poorly dyed and impure in color. Why is that? Because of the impurity of the cloth. In the same way, when the mind is corrupt, a bad destiny is to be expected. Suppose there was a cloth that was pure and clean. No matter what dye the dyer applied, whether blue or yellow or red or magenta, it would look well dyed and pure in color. Why is that? Because of the purity of the cloth. In the same way, when the mind isn't corrupt, a good destiny is to be expected. And what are the corruptions of the mind? Covetousness and immoral greed, ill will, anger, hostility, disdain, contempt, jealousy, stinginess, deceit, deviousness, obstinacy, aggression, conceit, arrogance, vanity, and negligence are corruptions of the mind. A mendicant who understands that covetousness and immoral greed are corruptions of the mind gives them up. A mendicant who understands that ill will and negligence is corruption of the mind gives it up. When they've understood these corruptions of the mind for what they are and have given them up, they have experiential confidence in the Buddha. That blessed one is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide for those who wish to train, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, blessed. They have experiential confidence in the teaching. This teaching is well explained by the Buddha, apparent in the present life, immediately effective, inviting inspection, relevant, so that sensible people can know it for themselves. They have experiential confidence in the Sangha. The Sangha of the Buddha's disciples is practicing the way that's good, direct, systematic, and proper. It consists of the 4 pairs, the 8 individuals. This is the Sangha of the Buddha's disciples that is worthy of offerings, dedicated to the gods, worthy of hospitality, worthy of a religious donation, worthy of greeting with joined palms, and is a supreme field of merit for the world. When a mendicant has discarded, eliminated, released, given up, and relinquished to this extent, thinking, I have experiential confidence in the Buddha, the teaching, and the Sangha, they find inspiration in the meaning and the teaching, find joy connected with the teaching. Thinking, I've discarded, eliminated, released, given up, and relinquished to this extent, they find inspiration in the meaning and the teaching and find joy connected with the teaching. When the joyful rapture springs up, when the mind is full of rapture, the body becomes tranquil. When the body is tranquil, they feel bliss. And when they're blissful, their mind becomes immersed in samadhi. When a mendicant of such ethics, such qualities, and such wisdom eats boiled fine rice with the dark grains picked out and served with many soups and sauces, that is no obstacle for them. Compare with cloth that is dirty and soiled. It can be made pure and clean by pure water, or unrefined gold, which can be made pure and bright by a forge. In the same way, when a mendicant of such ethics, such qualities, and such wisdom eats boiled fine rice with the dark grains picked out and served with many soups and sauces, that is no obstacle for them. They meditate spreading a heart of love, heart full of love to one direction, and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth. In the same way, above, below, across, everywhere, all around, they spread a heart full of love to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. They meditate spreading a heart full of compassion to one direction, and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth. In the same way, below, across, everywhere, all around, they spread a heart full of compassion to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. They meditate spreading a heart full of rejoicing to one direction, and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth. In the same way, above, below, across, everywhere, all around, they spread a heart full of rejoicing to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. They meditate spreading a heart full of equanimity to one direction, and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth. In the same way, above, below, across, everywhere, all round, they spread a heart full of equanimity to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. They understand there is this, there is what is worse than this, there is what is better than this, and there is an escape beyond the scope of perception. Knowing and seeing like this, their mind is freed from the defilements of sensuality, desire to be reborn, and ignorance. When they're freed, they know they're freed. They understand rebirth is ended. The spiritual journey has been completed. What has to be done has been done. There is no return to any state of existence. This is called a mendicant who is bathed with the inner bathing. Now, at that time, the Brahman Bharadvaja of Sundarika was sitting not far from the Buddha. He said to the Buddha, "But does Mr. Gautama go to the river Bahuka to bathe?" "Brahman, why go to the river Bahuka? What can the river Bahuka do?" "Many people deem that the river Bahuka leads to a heavenly world and bestows merit. And many people wash off their bad deeds in the river Bahuka." Then the Buddha addressed Bharadvaja of Sundarika in verse. The Bahuka and the Adhikaka and Gaya and Sundarika too, Saraswati and Payaga and the river Bahumati, a fool can constantly plunge into them, but it won't purify their dark deeds. What can the Sundarika do? What the Payaga or the Bahuka? They can't cleanse a cruel and criminal person from their bad deeds. For the pure in heart, it's always the spring festival or the Sabbath. For the pure in heart and clean of deed, their vows will always be fulfilled. It's here alone that you should bathe, Brahman, making yourself a sanctuary for all creatures. And if you speak no lies, nor harm any living creature, nor steal anything not given, and you're faithful and not stingy, what's the point of going to Gaya? For any well may be your Gaya. When he'd spoken, the Brahman Bharadvaja of Sundarika said to the Buddha, "Excellent, Mr. Gautama, excellent," as if he were righting the overturned, or revealing the hidden, or pointing out the path to the lost, or lighting a lamp in the dark so people with clear eyes can see what's there. Mr. Gautama has made the teaching clear in many ways. I go for refuge to Mr. Gautama, to the teaching, and to the mendicant Sangha. May I receive the going forth, the ordination in the ascetic Gautama's presence. And the Brahman Bharadvaja of Sundarika received the going forth, the ordination, in the Buddha's presence. Not long after his ordination, Venerable Bharadvaja, living alone, withdrawn, diligent, keen, and resolute, soon realized the supreme end of the spiritual path in this very life. He lived having achieved with his own insight the goal for which gentlemen rightly go forth from the lay life to homelessness. He understood rebirth is ended. The spiritual journey has been completed. What had to be done has been done. There is no return to any state of existence. And Venerable Bharadvaja became one of the perfected. So this is the Vata Sutta, and as you can see, it's a short, fairly straightforward sutta that's based on a very kind of nice, very simple, very nice simile, the simile of the cloth, and comparing the mind to the cloth, and then gives an exposition of some of the key points in the Buddha's path, and finally wraps up with the conversation with Sundarika Bharadvaja. So while we're going, I encourage you to please pop any questions into the chat. And meanwhile, I'm going to go back to the front of the start of the sutta, and we'll come and have a bit of comment on what is happening as we go along. Okay. Share. Okay. Okay, first of all, as to the setting, worth noticing that some of the Chinese versions all say the Buddha was at a river at this point rather than being in Savatthi, which is not notably known as being a river. Probably likely. So next, the simile of the cloth. Okay, so here I want to talk a little bit about the notion of defilements or corruptions, as they are here, sankilita or upakilita or upakilesa. So these are words we find very commonly in Buddhism, and the kilesas are essentially the forces in the mind that darken it, that corrupt it, that turn us towards doing what is bad. And one of the things which I think is really fundamental in Buddhism is that defilements are natural and defilements are normal. Greed, hatred, and delusion are found in everybody unless you're an arahant. So it's nothing special. And I think one of the things that we, because we see our own minds rather than seeing the minds of others, we tend to think that there's something, like we tend to think that our greed is something that's kind of especially heinous, or that our anger, we get very ashamed of it. But actually anger is just normal. Yeah? And so we try to be mindful of it. We try not to follow that path. But also there needs to be a sort of a sense of moderation about that, and understanding that these things actually are normal. Now, one of the things which we take for granted is that these defilements are something psychological. All right. And in Buddhism, this is sort of very kind of basic Buddhism 101, that these are forces inside the mind. But that's not always the case. And in certain belief systems, then sin or corruption or evil can be kind of a physical property, which can, for example, you have an idea of, like, say, the transferal of sin down through generations. So the sins of the parents are visited on the child. So the child obviously hasn't done the deeds that create the sin, but somehow the evil transmits itself through generations. And there's almost like a feeling that there's a kind of like a physical contact with evil. And even though in Buddhism we know that that's not the case, right? We know that, rationally, that choices to do good or bad are psychological choices. But there's still kind of a bit of a feeling around that, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to, like, when you're around a person who's done like really evil things, or, some kind of place that represents that, there's still kind of we react, or we respond in a kind of a physical way to the presence of evil, just as we do to the presence of good. Now, here it's talking about the basic Buddhist idea that the destiny of our future course will be dependent on how our mind is. Now, we need to qualify this in a couple of ways. First thing we need to qualify it in is to say that it is not the case that having some kind of random thought of greed or hate or delusion is somehow going to send you into some terrible realm of suffering. That's not how it works, okay? Your rebirth is determined by how you live, by the choices you make every day. And if you've lived as a good person, keeping your precepts, being generous, being kind, then it's not possible that, a single thought or something will somehow send your mind into a bad place. So even though here it's talking about the corruptions in the mind, technically the corruptions in the mind are what cause us to make choices or actions. And it's those choices or actions that determine our future course. So in Buddhism, we can understand that in terms of 3 stages, really. So the underlying motivation, which is the defilements or lack thereof, and then the actions we make based on that, and then finally the result, which is the experiences that we have in our lives. So those 3 things, the motivations, the action, and the results. It's possible to have defilements in your mind and still do something good. Like you can be angry in your mind and still do kind deeds, right? But it's not that the anger in your heart is sort of determining what your choices are. You can be mindful of that, recognize that you're angry, and then determine to do kind deeds in order to counteract your anger. And so there's not like a one-to-one relationship between these things. But generally speaking, the tendency is that when your mind has these different corruptions, then that will send you to a bad destiny. And when the mind is, the choices made by the mind are inspired by the good qualities, then you have a good destiny. So that's one point. Second point to make is that destiny has means at a basic level, like it means both this life. So in this life, we make choices that affect where we end up, and the manner that our life unfolds responds to the choices that we make. And this is a really crucial aspect of Buddhism. So the Buddha is what he called a Kiryavada, a doctrine of action. And what that means is that the crucial things about you and the crucial thing about your life is not the things that happen to you. It's about the things that you do. So we are not the victims of our lives. We are the protagonists of our lives. And we are the ones, what's interesting about life is not what happens to you. What's interesting about life is how you respond to what happens to you. That's how you create the story of who you are in the terms of how you respond to what happens to you. So this is the aspect of Buddhism, which is a Kiryavada. So you can create those circumstances of your life in this very life. And Buddhism also teaches that the same principle applies when we die, because death is just a change. Death is not anything which is particularly metaphysically different from what we're experiencing in life. We experience life and we experience changes. Death is a more abrupt change. And so the same principles apply. But also it applies to freedom from all of this. So freedom from rebirth, freedom from suffering is also an outcome of the purity of the mind. So there's a slight asymmetry here, whereas a corruption in the mind can lead you to being trapped into states of suffering. Purity of the mind leads you to states of happiness, but it also leads to states beyond states of happiness, which is what we call nibbana or liberation. So that's just a few thoughts about the idea of the kilesa, or the corruptions of the mind. Now, this particular sutta goes on to list a bunch of kilesas, and these are kinds of lists that we find a number of times throughout the suttas. The Buddha taught about them in a simple form as greed, hatred, and delusion, and then would spell it out in more detail as we find here, covetousness and immoral greed. So these two are abhijna and visamalobha. These refer to excessive forms of greed. So the Buddha is starting out not with just any form of greed, right? But covetousness is the desire to own what somebody else owns, right? And so this is a kind of strong form of greed. And immoral greed, visamalobha, is a kind of greed which is inherently immoral or unethical or unjustified. So, for example, if you have desire for your husband or desire for your wife, then this is a kind of greed, but this is a righteous greed or a legitimate kind of greed. Your partner is a legitimate partner. Whereas if you have a kind of greed that you want to sleep with somebody else's partner, or sleep with someone who's underage, or someone who doesn't consent, for example, then this would all be examples of visamalobha, of immoral greed. So this is kind of strong forms of greed that transgress what is normally considered acceptable in society. Moving along, ill will, anger, hostility, disdain, contempt, jealousy, stinginess, deviousness, obstinacy, aggression, conceit, arrogance, vanity, and negligence. So most of those, I think, are pretty straightforward. So if you understand that they're corruptions of the mind, you give them up. Good. The text is quite abbreviated, as you can see on the screen. The Pali text spells all of these out, and in the translation, I abbreviated them to some degree. Okay, so when you have done that, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm just going to, hang on, I'm not going to stop sharing yet. I'm going to come back, see if we've got any so Joni asks whether there's any significance to noticing 3 primary colors as red, yellow, and blue plus white. Mercy. I don't know if there's any particular significance to that. I mean, they're obviously primary colors. I guess they're probably chosen by the colors that were available for dyes. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. Anyway, so next one. So then somebody who's done that and who's been able to abandon these things has experiential confidence in the Buddha, avecca pasada. So avecca pasada is a technical term, literally meaning having undergone. So that's the kind of etymological meaning of avecca. So it means the faith that you have when you have undergone something for yourself. In other words, experiential confidence. So this is the faith of a stream enterer who has seen the Dhamma for themselves. And this is expressed in terms of the Itipiso formula. And I'm sure many of you, probably most of you, are familiar with this formula, recited in basically every Theravada temple, every Theravada ceremony. Itipiso bhagava arahang sama sambuddho vidya charana sampanno. And then if any of you join in with our Friday night talks here in Sydney, then you'll be familiar because we chant these each week. And it's a great chant to learn if you haven't learned it, because once you know it, then whenever you travel, especially in any Theravada temple around the world, then you can always join in with the chanting. So that's really nice to be able to join with the community and to recite these words in homage to the Buddha. These chants, which list the qualities of the Buddha, are meant to the purpose of reciting these is so that we can lift our mind up to those qualities. And so when we're reciting them, it's good to know what they actually mean and to be able to reflect on them and to be able to remember that the Buddha is not something. The Buddha is not like a deity. He's not like a completely different kind of being or anything like that, but he represents that which is best in all of us, the potential which is best in all of us. And so we can raise ourselves to that level of potential. I'll just give a brief story on that. I have a very dear friend here in Sydney. His name is Hugh. And his wife, he and his wife Tangan were in their house one day, and they had new neighbors moved in next door, and they hadn't met them, didn't know anything about them. But something had gone wrong, because even though they hadn't really properly moved in, they hadn't even put curtains up or anything on their house, they were just yelling and yelling and yelling and screaming at each other. And poor old Hugh and his wife were sitting there feeling very uncomfortable, very awkward. Like, what do you do when you hear this kind of noise? So eventually Tamngan walked out to the front of the house just to see what was going on and make sure there wasn't any violence or anything. And she could see right into the front room of the house because they didn't have any curtains. And she just stood there on the lawn and looking in, and this couple were just standing there yelling at each other and screaming at each other. And she didn't know what they were yelling about, and she didn't know what was going on, and she didn't know what to do. And so all of a sudden, it just occurred to her, she put her hands in Anjali like this towards them, and then just bowed deeply in their direction. And they looked out onto their front lawn, and they saw this strange woman bowing to them. And they're like, what's going on? So they sort of came out and said, well, sorry, who are you? What's going on? And she said, oh, look, I just wanted to know that I'm a Buddhist. And when I saw you, I could see the bodhisattva in you. I could see the Buddhahood in you. I could see the perfection in you. and so I bowed to that in you, which is the most holy. And when they heard this, they were like completely flabbergasted. They'd never heard anything like this before. And they felt so ashamed about their behavior. And they just apologized. They said, "Oh, look, we're really sorry. We're not like this. Please don't judge us for this. We were very stressed out because of moving and we had this misunderstanding. So please, let's be friends." And then after that, they became the best of neighbors. And the reason I know that story was because one time they had to leave the house and they said, they had to leave the dog behind. They said, "Don't worry, my neighbor will come over and feed the dog." They do that whenever we're away. So that's what happens when you bow to your neighbors when they're arguing. So this idea of recollecting the Buddha is not just about, that guy over there on the shrine, but it's about finding those qualities inside yourself. And so you can use these as the basis for recollection meditation on the qualities of the Buddha, and seeing them, remembering that they are the qualities of the Buddha, and also internalizing them and finding those same qualities inside yourself. The next one, the teaching or the Dhamma is well explained by the Buddha. Apparent in the present life, immediately effective, inviting inspection, relevant so that sensible people can know it for themselves. So this is part of the realization of the stream enterer. They have direct experience of the Four Noble Truths. So notice the teachings here, sanditthiko, akaliko. So these are both words that specifically mean that it is something that pertains to this very life, as opposed to pertaining to future lives. So what that means is that we're not practicing Dhamma so we can get reborn in heaven or whatever, however we might conceive it, but we are practicing Dhamma so that we can let go of our defilements, as we saw earlier in the sutta, purify our mind, and to realize the results of that here and now. So this is the meaning of those words, sanditthiko, akaliko. This is the Buddha's promise, and it's that promise which has been realized by the stream enterer who has actually seen those things for themselves. And then finally, the experiential confidence in the Sangha, the four, practicing the way that's good, supatipanno, direct, ujju patipanno, systematic, nyaya patipanno, and proper, samichi patipanno. So the four pairs, the 8 individuals. So just reading from my note here. So the suttas distinguish between 2 senses of Sangha. Mendicant Sangha, Bhikkhu Sangha, is the conventional community of monks and nuns, which we will see referred to at the end of the sutta. The Sangha of disciples, the Savaka Sangha, is classified as fourfold according to the stages of awakening: stream entry, once return, non-return, and perfection or arahantship. Each of these stages is further subdivided into those of the path who are practicing for realization and those of the fruit who have realized. And these are referred to as noble disciples, 4 of the path and 4 of the fruit, making 8 individuals in total. So in the suttas, we don't find the word Sangha used in the sense of spiritual community, which of course is a very common usage today. The recollection here, since one of the purposes of this series is to look at the way that the Buddha responded to other religious paths, it's interesting that in describing the Sangha here, it has ahuneo, pahuneo, dakyuneo, anjalikaraneo. So ahuneo, worthy of the ahuna, is these are the typically worthy offerings dedicated to the gods. An example of which would be the offering of rice and ghee that we saw in the Dhaniya Sutta last week. Worthy of hospitality. I just want to make a quick word on this, on the virtue of hospitality here. Hospitality is something that I think we have kind of forgotten the virtue of, because we have like Airbnb and hotels and stuff like that. And we expect that you're going to go somewhere and you're going to find a place. But hospitality is, if you look around the ancient world, is one of the great virtues of the ancient world. Not just in India, but in other places as well. Often you had no way of telling people you're going to be there, no way of people would know. And so to be able to take a stranger into your home and to care for them and to look after them was considered to be one of the highest forms of merit. So much in Greek mythology, the god of hospitality was none other than Zeus himself. Okay. And finally, worthy of religious donation, dakshineya. So the dakshina is the fee which was payable to priests for a religious service. So in the Brahmanical system, if you had to, you wanted to do some kind of sacrifice, you wanted to do some kind of ritual, then you would employ a number of priests who would come and they would set up the ritual and then they would do that. It's kind of complicated. Like if you're doing those rituals properly, they have like all of these specialized tasks, and each of the priests has its own thing, and one person's reciting and one person's like physically doing all the things, and you have to set up the altar in a particular way, and all of these details is very specialized knowledge. So you're paying for the service for these things, and sometimes that payment would be a lot, of course, which then raises allegations that it's just corruption, you're just doing it for the money, which I'm sure was the case at least sometimes. So, sorry, we had a raised question from someone. Sorry, they disappeared when I just noticed them. Sorry, someone has a question? Sorry, I missed that. I saw the hand up, but then I didn't see it. Okay, so anyway, Vandana asks, where do these chantings come from? Were they written during the time of the Buddha? Yes, well, they do come from the early text, right? So this is what we're reading is from the suttas themselves. So these are all from presumably the time of the Buddha, and they are found in a very, very similar form across all of the Buddhist traditions. So if you look in the different Chinese translations, Tibetan translations, the Sanskrit and so on, then they will have these same formulas in a very similar way. So yes, they do come from a very early time. They probably weren't written at the earliest time, but they were there from the earliest time. Okay. Sorry, yes, please.
Sorry to... I'm just thinking about these Itipiso chantings. So are they specifically from Theravada traditions? So were they actually written during Buddha's time, or maybe not?
Okay, so the Itipiso is common. This is part of a common tradition. So most of the things you find in the suttas are part of common Buddhist traditions. So it's not restricted to just Pali tradition, but it's found in the Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit traditions as well. As far as writing, there wasn't writing used for texts in the earliest times. So the texts were recorded and passed down in an oral tradition. So they were there from the early time, but they weren't written down until later.
Oh,
okay.
Thanks.
Michael, was that you Michael Featherstone, was that you who was asking a question before? Sorry. You had your hand up?
I'm sorry, that was an accident. I'm sorry.
That was an accident. Oh, well, how's it going anyway?
Fine, thank you. Sorry.
No worries. Okay, good. Let us proceed. Okay, moving along. So then recollecting what they've done. So this next part is then interesting. So they can recollect that they have given up and relinquished to this extent, yatodi. And then they can find inspiration in the meaning and the teaching and find joy connecting with the teaching. So this is labati attavedang, labati dhammavedang, labati dhammupasanhitang pamojang. So this is a special quality of a stream enterer in particular, who can recollect on the fact that they've realized the Dhamma, and just that much is enough to give rise to joy. And then that can then propel their meditation and deepen their practice further. And so that's like one of the great advantages to being a stream enterer. But of course, as with all these things, it's also true, might be true more to a greater extent for a stream enterer, but for everybody, then the same thing can apply. So we can, we're all capable of recollecting what are those defilements or corruptions that we have abandoned. Maybe not completely, right? But even to let go of them a little bit is still pretty good, right? And you can remember, oh yeah, I was angry that time. I actually was at an event last Thursday, just after our last class, and we had a Wesak ceremony here in our local Parliament House in New South Wales. And I was talking to one of my friends there, Michael, who does the does a lot of the sound. I'm not sure if Michael's here today. He's probably at work. And Michael sort of ran into somebody who he hadn't seen since university days. And they were in like some kind of university political thing or something like that. And he's just like remembering, oh yeah, we had this really big argument and this really big fight in those days, you know? And it's like, it seems so wild that you just kind of get really angry with, now I can't even remember what it was about. And it's all that time later. And you think like, why do we do that? You know, why do we destroy our relationships and our connections with people because we want to argue with them about having some different political view or something? And these things are never as important as we imagine they are. All right. Okay. So Winnie is asking if I can explain something about the different 4 stages of awakening, of what they are and the difference between each stage. Well, look, I can, but I'm going to do it fairly briefly because otherwise I'm going to run out of time because that could be a whole course in itself. Okay. So we have the first stage of awakening is the stream enterer. So the stream, which is what we're talking about so far here in the Vata Sutta. Stream enterer has, 1 second, got some machinery starting in the background. I'm going to see if there's a window that I can close, hopefully make that a bit quiet. Okay. All right, so stream enterer has completed all of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. They have realized, right, fully realized the 4 Noble Truths, and they have abandoned 3 fetters. So the different noble individuals are characterized in terms of how many out of 10 fetters that they've managed to abandon. So stream enterer has abandoned 3. Attachment to the externals of religious conduct, like so silabata, so attachment to rites and rituals, or attachment to ethics and vows. Then they've discarded attavada is the attachment to views of the self, and what's the other one? And doubt. That's right. And they've abandoned doubt. So they've abandoned doubt because you've seen the path. So you're not worried about is this the path or not, because you've seen it. So that's the stream enterer. The stream enterer is said to be enlightened in minimum of 7 lifetimes. Okay, so and they can't go to any bad destiny. So this is the first stage, the stream enterer. And then in the second stage is a once returner. So once returner, in addition to abandoning those 3 fetters of the stream enterer, has also reduced greed and hatred. Not completely, but mostly they've got rid of greed and hatred. Then the anagami, or the non-returner, has completely got rid of greed and hatred, leaving 5 fetters left that the anagami or non-returner has. And the non-returner has conceit. See if I can remember them all. Rupa raga, arupa raga, that's attachment. But rupa raga and arupa raga is basically attachment to getting reborn in the jhana realms, in the realms corresponding to the jhanas. Uddhacha, they have restlessness. So restlessness for them doesn't mean that they can't sit still in meditation, but restlessness means that they're pushing too hard in their practice. So it's still the possibility that they'll be like pushing too much. This is the restlessness of the anagami. And finally, ignorance. So they still haven't fully seen the truth in all respects. So these are the 10 fetters. So each of these 4 stages is defined in terms of like a progressive elimination of some of these fetters. Worth noting, though, that the important part about these stages of awakening is that the way to get to each of the stages of awakening is the Noble Eightfold Path. So it doesn't really matter where you're at, whether you're nowhere, whether you're starting at the ground level or below the ground level, or whether you're already an arahant. Doesn't matter, then the Eightfold Path is still the practice. Okay, So thanks for that. So the stream enter is able to recollect their abandoning of hindrances, and through that get into samadhi. That means into deep meditation. If you have such ethics, qualities, and wisdom, evang silo, evang dhammo, evang panyo, slightly unusual turn of phrase here with evang dhammo. And even if you have boiled fine rice with dark grains picked out and served with many soups and sauces, that's no obstacle for them. So what that means is that you're not going to be tempted away from the path, even by sensual temptations like delicious food. And one of the things which is kind of an assumption there is just knowing that for monastics, then food is usually the most fun you have in the day, right? I mean, you know, and it does become like a big thing. Like if you're, you know, you just kind of, especially like I remember when I was a young monk, like you'd finish the meal time, and then you go back to your kuti or something like that, and then you just think about food for until like 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you'd like get like a couple of hours of freedom from thinking about tomorrow's meal. And that was basically kind of life. So yeah, so that's why there's kind of particular emphasis on eating food there. So there may have been some context to that we're not aware of. So there may have been like some monks. So sometimes there are stories in the Vinaya where the monks would be like jostling or trying to set themselves up so they get like an invitation to the house that has they've got good food there, and we'll try to get ourselves an invitation to go along to them. So there may have been some kind of context like that behind that passage there. All right, so then it goes on to talk about the Brahma viharas, divine meditations for wholesome emotional states that can be developed as a basis for samadhi. These were evidently pre-Buddhist, though they have not been traced as a group in pre-Buddhist texts. However, they are shared with later non-Buddhist texts, such as the Yoga Sutra 1.33 and the Jain Tattvartha Sutra 7.11. So these four Brahma viharas then are part of a pan-Indian religious philosophy or religious path. They're not restricted to early Buddhism, also found in late Buddhism, Mahayana and so on, also found in Jainism, also found in Brahmanism. So this is one thing that everybody agrees on. And sometimes Buddhism and early Buddhism is presented in a way that's kind of a bit dry and a bit intellectual and so on. But I think it's really important to know that there is a huge emotional component to this. And we've already seen that. The Buddha's talking about the joy and the rapture that arise from contemplating the Dhamma. And it's an emotional process. I think this is a really important thing to bear in mind. When we are developing meditation, developing our path to meditation, the path of joy and happiness is crucial. It's a crucial dimension of this path. It doesn't matter what kind of meditation we're doing, what our background is, or anything like that. It's not meant to be something that is clinical. It's not meant to be something that's objective. It's not meant to be something that is suspicious of or afraid of feelings and emotions. On the contrary, it's about developing those positive and wholesome emotions, which is, as we're seeing, a major part of the development of meditation here. So the first of these Brahma viharas is metta, is love. This is unconditional positive regard and well-wishing. And this is love free of attachment, free of desire. Usually or often translated as loving kindness. Okay, so usually people translate metta as loving kindness, and I became dissatisfied with loving kindness as a translation over the years. Why? Because it's a kind of a Buddhist term, And it seems to me that it's a kind of emotionally distancing term. Like if I'm talking to you, good people of the United States, sitting there in your home or wherever else you are, sitting in your home, and I say to you something like loving kindness, then that's a kind of a cool kind of emotional state. But if I say love, then that to me has something more powerful. Like I can feel it when I say it. It's a more vulnerable thing to talk about. And so I think that there's something deeper and more profound in that notion of love than that we're kind of skipping. So one of the things I tried to do in my translation was to try to restore something of that emotional directness to it and avoid distancing language. Okay. Right, so Vandana mentions even as an 8th preceptor, the food is becoming more tempting than before, right? Right? You see, that's wisdom, right? So Sume, how's it going, Sume, asks, is the Buddha implying that only the Savaka Sangha is a field of merits for the world, not the Bhikkhu Sangha community? I don't think the Buddha was really meaning to imply that. Certainly the Buddha did say that if you give to the enlightened beings, that because of the purity of their heart, then it's very fruitful offering. But the Buddha didn't really encourage people to think like that. I mean, he wasn't a kind of an investment management advisor whose purpose was to how do you get the best return on your investment. There's a classic sutta when one of the Jain disciples comes to see him and asks the Buddha, and has a sneaky plan. He's going to ask the Buddha, who should I give gifts to? And then the Buddha's going to say, give gifts to my community, and then I'll trap him and I'll say, you see, you're only asking people to give things to yourselves. And so he goes to ask the Buddha, and he says, where should I give my gifts? And the Buddha says, give where your heart feels inspired. He says, well, we lost that argument. The Buddha said, what argument were we having? So give where your heart feels inspired. I wouldn't worry too much about or worrying about where it's going to give. So metta is maitri in Sanskrit. It means friendship. Yes, also friendship is another part of the meaning as well, or another aspect of the meaning. Okay, moving along. Next one, compassion. Right, compassion. So compassion means to understand the suffering of another and to have that wish to remove that suffering. So metta, so the difference between metta and compassion is that metta is more simple. Metta is more childlike. Metta is more playful. Metta doesn't know anything about suffering. Right? It's just that pure well-wishing. Compassion begins with that act of feeling suffering. Yeah. And has that wish to remove it or wish to alleviate it. So it has a kind of dynamic sense to it. So this is why compassion is always taught after metta. If you haven't developed metta strongly, it's possible, I won't say it's likely, but I think for some people, it's possible that compassion can go wrong. You can over-identify with suffering and get caught up into it. And I think actually that's something that we can all feel, that, sometimes we look in the news or we look at what suffering that's happening around the world and you think, this suffering that's happening, what can I do about it? And it's easy to get overwhelmed by that and to get drawn into that. And so that's why development of metta is really important. It gives us that emotional wholeness and health. Then we can start introducing the compassion. And then the next one is mudita, which is rejoicing. Yay. So that's when you see someone do something good and you say, great, we're going to rejoice with that. Yes. And I'll tell you a very brief story about this. One of the things that I do when I go to travel to different parts of the world sometimes is that I get people to introduce each other and then tell each other something good that they've done that day. So you have to meet someone, tell them something good, and then you have to rejoice in it and do mudita. And look, this is something I've done this in the States, and I have to say Americans have no problem with doing this, with telling people what good they've done. They're really good at that. When I went to Ireland, I was in Dublin, and I said I'd do this, and they just looked at me and said, "Oh no, we don't, we wouldn't do that, no." I said, no, you have to do that. So they force them to overcome their conditioning and actually acknowledge the fact that they had done something good. So this is mudita. And then finally, upekkha. So upekkha is the, upekkha, we translate that as equanimity, but it doesn't mean indifference. Actually, upekkha literally means closely watching over. So upekkha is to closely watch over something, without rushing in and interfering, not micromanaging and all of that stuff, but just to be able to watch over, to know if you need to act, then we can act, but not to interfere unless it's really necessary. And so that aspect of equanimity, again, needs to come out of all of those other qualities. If we try to do too much equanimity from the beginning, then we run that risk of turning into indifference and hard-heartedness. And there's a sort of coldness which you can get from spiritual life, where like nothing matters because the only thing that matters is nibbana, and so you don't care. There's like a little, when we were at our talk a couple of weeks ago in Harris Park, and there was a little kitten crying outside, and we went and one of the ladies there went and rescued the kitten, looked after her and so on. She's adopted it and taken care of it now. And to me, that was such a good example that we don't let us, if you find that your spiritual path is leading you to be more cruel and more heartless towards others, something's gone wrong. Yeah. All right. Moving on, then the next part, there is this, there is what is worse than this, there is what is better than this, there is an escape beyond the scope of perception. Ati idang, ati hinang, ati panetang, ati imasa sanyagatasa, uttari nissarananti pajanati. Right, so ati idang, there is this, right? All of this. Yeah, this is where I am. Right? This is where life is. Yeah. So when we say a phrase like this, ati idang, actually this is almost a kind of Upanishadic turn of phrase. This kind of way of just talking about profound things using this very, very simple language. Ati idang, there is this. This, in a way, this is like, to use a pronoun like idang is empty, like it doesn't mean anything. There is this. What is it? A cup? Is it a wall? Is it that noise, which I'm not sure if you can hear, but it's really annoying on this end? There is this. But at the same time, it's very profound because you're pointing to everything that is all around you. There is this. There is this stage as a stream enterer. Remember, we're talking about someone who's practiced and developed stream entry at this point. There is this realization, this state of mind that they have manifested. There's what's worse than that, the path that they've come from, greater ignorance, greater defilements, and then there is what is better, yeah? And then there is an escape, which is nibbana. Now notice that escape is phrased in terms of sanyagatasa, what is within the scope of perception. So this is, I think, this is maybe kind of tenuous, but I think this is a, sorry, I'm just hoping that our handyman will, or handy person will stop drilling or whatever they're doing. Anyway, I'll continue to speak. Hopefully you can hear me above the racket here.
We don't hear that.
You don't hear that at all. Good. Well, that's good.
Just a little.
Just a little. So that's thanks for that. So this is my good microphone, obviously. All right. Yes, the sanyagatasa. I believe this is actually a reference or a usage which is derived from a particular dialogue in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where Yajnavalkya, the great sage of the Upanishads, talks about the realization of enlightenment in his system in terms of the cessation of perception. And so this use of perception in terms of kind of like a limited consciousness that is associated with the extent of the world, I think is from usage of Yajnavalkya. That is brought up in more detail in the Potthapada Sutta in the Digha Nikaya. I won't sort of insist on that here, but I'm just going to throw that out there. So knowing and seeing like this, they're freed, okay, and then they become an arahant. Okay, so far, the terms and ideas that the Buddha is talking about are for the most part pretty standard, and for the most part pretty just straight Buddhist teachings. And then right at the end here, he has to throw this little bit in here. This is called a mendicant who is bathed with the inner bathing. And he just sort of has to throw that one in at the end. Why? Presumably because he's seen the Brahmin who's sitting there, right? And so he's trying to stir the pot a little bit. This is what I think he's doing. He's just like kind of throwing this out. What? It's bathed with the inner bathing? So again, we don't really get a lot of sense of the context here, but probably it was normally the case that when the Buddha was teaching that there might have been quite a few people around, and people from all different backgrounds and so on. And as I mentioned, I think in the Chinese versions of this, that says that it was by the side of a river. So perhaps he was actually down there to do the ritual purification, or perhaps there were others nearby who were doing that ritual purification. Now, for Buddhists to be critical of the outer bathing of the bathing ritual is, of course, a standard Buddhist critique. But also, I think really important to remember that this is not just Buddhists who say this. In fact, even the later Brahmanical texts regarded external bathing as being spiritually effective only when it's accompanied by inner bathing or purity of soul. The Mahabharata says that he who is bathed in the bath of self-discipline is clean inside and out. Yeah? While the Linga Purana insists that one who is bathed externally must also practice the inner bathing. So these are using very similar language. You can see practice the inner bathing, abhyantarang, where it says antarena. So this is basically very similar language which is being used in the Brahmanical texts as is being used in the Buddhist texts as well. This, I think, is really important point. When the Buddha wasn't saying, if you notice what the Buddha was saying at this point, he's not saying, well, the Brahmins are wrong because they do their bathing externally, and we're right because we do the inner bathing, right? He was simply pointing out that when we reach purity through that inner bathing. And actually within the Brahmanical tradition, there is so much variation and so many people doing so many different kinds of things. And this is something that I see a lot today with people making critiques of religion. Now, obviously, we live in a time when religion is being criticized very validly for many, many perfectly good reasons. And yet I feel sometimes that there is a kind of a strange disjunct between the people who criticize religion and the people who live a religious life. And like most of the people that I know who are Christians, for them, Christianity might be going to the church on a Sunday and meeting your friends, maybe participating in some charity work and helping people or something like that. And for a lot of people, it's part of building a community, it's a part of helping people, it's a part of supporting good conduct and so on. And then what people think it is and what is the actual experience of the people doing it is often quite different. And I think it's really important that when we are considering the relationship between Buddhism and other religious paths, that we just bear that in mind. It doesn't mean that we can't have critiques of them, as the Buddha is quite capable of doing that, but it just means to be careful and compassionate and empathetic when making those critiques. So, and remember that those same critiques are very often made within the religion themselves, as we've seen here. All right. So the Bahuka River, we'll come on to in just 1 second. Okay, so the Brahman says that the river Bahuka leads to a heavenly world and bestows merit, and many people wash off their bad deeds in the river Bahuka. Yeah. Now, remember I talked earlier about how defilements or corruptions in Buddhism are seen as being something which is mental, it's like psychological qualities. And so here we're seeing this kind of perhaps more primitive idea that there's this kind of sin, like a palpable physical evil that manifests, that can be actually washed off. And this is definitely a real belief, and you find many kind of stories about these kinds of things. For the Jains, evil or karma was a kind of quasi-physical particles that kind of infested your soul in a way like the particles infesting the cloth that we saw in the simile at the beginning. And for the Brahmins, you find like stories where you'll have like scapegoat rituals where, say, if a man has committed a sin, they'll have they'll get in like a bunk beds with the man who's done a sin at the top and the Brahmin underneath, and then they'll pour water on the one on top and wash the sin off, and then the sin will go on to the Brahmin below. So the Brahmin becomes the scapegoat, but because they're a Brahmin, then they can purify the sin. So these are kind of quasi-physical ideas of sin and corruption and evil are definitely real, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that and not to just assume that everybody sees good and evil as being purely mental or purely psychological things. All right, so a couple of notes here on the usage. So the word loka sammata, loka sammata, conducive to a heavenly world, right? So the word loka is from the same root as light, or the same root as world, or loka in world. This is a very unusual, probably unique usage in Pali of loka, L-O-K-K-H-A, in this particular sense. But it is quite close in sense to the usage we find a lot in the Shatapada Brahmana. That's one of the most important pre-Buddhist Brahmanical texts. So in other words, the Brahmin here is using language that is very typical of the Brahmanical texts and which is atypical of the Buddhist texts. And so obviously this is quite a subtle detail, but it does lend credence to the fact that this is the actual words which the Brahmin was using, rather than using the kind of language that the Buddha would be more commonly using. For the just a couple of notes on the bathing for purity from misdeeds, attested in the Shukla Yajurveda in 3.48. In the Therigatha, the Bhikkhuni Pundika pointed out that if it were true, then the fishes, frogs, and turtles would go to heaven. And interestingly, that this too is an argument not just found among the Buddhists, echoed by the Jains in the Suyagatha, and by the later Brahmins in the Linga Purana as well. So when we see the practice of the bathing and the external bathing, and we might say, well, inner purification is more important, then this is another pan-Indian idea, like we've seen the Brahma viharas, also a pan-Indian idea, but the idea of inner purification, also a pan-Indian idea. One of the differences would be really that in the Buddhist tradition, we tend to sort of drop those things and say, well, there's not really any point. Whereas in the Hindu tradition, they keep them and then interpret them as well. So you more sort of build on top of it. Yes, yes, you do the external bathing, but you also have to do the inner bathing as well. Okay. So a few more details here. The names of the rivers. Bahuka is mentioned only here. There's a Bahuda mentioned in a few places, maybe the same place. Again, the Adhikaka River is also mentioned only in this place. I think this is important to note because even though the Buddhists and the Brahmins and the Jains were sharing the same land at the same time, and their scriptures talk about many of the same things, of course, none of our scriptures are complete. and there are things mentioned in Brahmanical or Jain scriptures we don't find in Buddhist texts. In the same way, we find things mentioned in Buddhist texts that are not found in those other ones. So Buddhist texts are part of a contribution to understanding Indian culture as a whole. Gaya is a ford on the Palgu River by the town of Gaya, which is still a popular site for the sake of bathing today. Sundarika, it was in Kosala, it was used for Brahmanical rituals and said to bring beauty according to the Mahabharata. Sarasvati, so this is a list of rivers. Sarasvati is better known from the Sanskrit form Sarasvati, the most prominent river of the Vedas, who, to quote from the Rig Veda, like a snorting boar, broke the back of the mountains with her mighty waves. So clearly we're talking about a very aggressive, powerful river coming down from the Himalayas. But change stole her waters and today she is lost. Researchers have identified her with the now residual Gagahakra system in northwestern India and Pakistan, or with the Helmand River in Afghanistan. So the loss of the Sarasvati was one of the major geographical changes to affect the northwest of India. Prayaga, former modern Prayagraj, former Allahabad, is the sacred ford on the confluence of the Ganges and Yamuna beside Kosambi. Mahabharata calls it the vulva of the world, the most meritorious of all fords where bathing can wash away 100 crimes. The Bahumati River is elsewhere only known by a passing mention in Sanskrit reference works. It's the epithet of Indra, meaning strong of arm. So this is a list of different rivers and fords and bathing places, and the Buddha is saying that they can't cleanse a cruel and criminal person from their bad deeds. For the pure of heart, it's always the spring festival or the Sabbath. So the spring festival is the Phagu, which is supposed to be held at Gaya. And the Sabbath, of course, is the Uposatha, which is the weekly ceremony for Buddhists as well as others. The Buddha goes on, for the pure of heart and pure and clean indeed, their vows will always be fulfilled. It's here alone you should bathe Brahman, making yourself a sanctuary for all creatures. So kema or sanctuary is a place of safety for wild creatures, a meaning featured in several Jataka stories. Now the word kema is one of my favorite words in the Pali language, and has a very kind of, I think a very beautiful meaning. So notice how in that verse it talks about how you make yourself a kema, make yourself a refuge for all the creatures. So the idea of a kema, it seems, originally came from the very old times before the Indo-Europeans even came to India, when they were wandering pastless on the steppes of the Caucasian plains. And they would travel with their cattle and their horses, their goats and sheep perhaps, across the grasslands and the hills. And it's a hard life, and the ground is rocky, and the weather is uncertain, and there are bandits, and there's a restlessness and a lack of security to that kind of lifetime. But at the end of each day, they would come to a place of rest, perhaps a water hole with some trees, some grass around there. And when they came there, they would unyoke their beasts, put the burden down on the ground, release the animals to go and feed on the grass, and then they would bathe in the clear waters and light a fire, cook some food. And that place was called a kema. And so this is the idea of what a kema is, like a sanctuary, yeah? So like almost like a national park or something like that. And it's always regarded as being a place where both humans, but also animals, are going to be free from harm. And so in the Jataka stories, there's a number of beautiful stories where a kema is both the name of a princess, but also the name of a park or a lake, which the princess somehow becomes the sponsor of, or somehow becomes the guarantor of the safety of that. So one of the words in Buddhism for nibbana is the yoga kema, and yoga meaning a tying or a burden, the yoke, and the kema meaning the, as I just explained. So this is the sort of the metaphorical background to that term. So yoga kema, nibbana, is the place that you reach at the end of the day where you can unburden yourself, rest, be safe and secure. And so this is the meaning of yoga kema or nibbana. Okay. And moving along, you should bathe, making yourself a sanctuary for all beings, then speaking no lies, nor harming any little creature, nor stealing anything not given. So these are basically the 5 precepts that he's teaching here. Again, 5 precepts, another pan-Indian teaching. We find in Buddhism, we find in Jainism, we find it in Hinduism as well. More or less, there's slight differences, but the same basic idea. So these are sort of basic lay ethics which the Buddha is teaching to Sundarika Bharadvaja. And I make the point there that this is reminiscent of the universal values of Dhamma, which were promoted by King Ashoka in his edicts. So when King Ashoka came to power about 150 years after the Buddha, as a Buddhist king of India, he promoted the Dhamma, but he didn't promote the Dhamma in a way of saying, you know, we have to convert everybody, we have to make everybody believe in Buddhism or anything like that. As you can see, the Buddha is not doing here. And the Buddha is simply recommending good conduct which is considered good within his religion, within the Brahmanical religion, just as it is within the Buddhist religion. Nonetheless, Bharadvaja takes refuge and goes forth and becomes enlightened. That last passage is conventional, and it's worth noting that in the suttas, Bharadvaja is more or less a placeholder for a Brahmin who's usually about to get set up in some kind of way. So Bharadvaja is one of the classical sort of Vedic clan names. But in Buddhism, Bharadvaja is always distinguished by a first name. So in this case, Sundarika Bharadvaja. But Sundarika is really just the name of the river. So it just means Bharadvaja by the river Sundarika, or Bharadvaja of the river Sundarika. And usually the names of the Bharadvajas are kind of epithets like this. So they don't really have too much kind of personal existence outside of being a sort of placeholder for a Brahmin who's getting set up for conversion by the Buddha. But nonetheless, that's who Sundarika Bharadvaja is in this particular sutta. All right, so how are we going for timing? Oh, not doing too badly. All right. We've got a few comments here, so I'm just going to respond to a few of these comments by these very kind people who are showing that they're paying attention. It's very gratifying when you're a teacher to have people who can ask sensible comments, and you know that people aren't just sort of vaguing out or anything like that. Okay, so Leanne. Sorry, not sure exactly how I pronounce that. Sometimes when meditating or listening to the teachings, rapture and joy arise, but it is not awakening. Yes, that's true. So these things that we call rapture and joy, of course, these are just emotions, right? And emotions are incredibly diverse, and they have this whole spectrum. So, you know, rapture isn't rapture, joy isn't joy, tranquility isn't tranquility. I mean, each one of these is a whole range of different things. So if you're listening to the Dhamma and then you're thinking, oh, where does that joy come? When is that joy coming? When is that joy coming? Then you're probably not going to get anything. But when you can let go in those unexpected moments, I always remember one of those moments for me was when I was reading, there's a discourse which is called the hair-raising discourse, but I didn't know that. And then I read it, and then towards the end of it, the hairs stood up on me when I was reading it. And then I turned over the last page and I said, oh, this is called the hair-raising discourse. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's why. That's why. So, but what those things are is that they're a sign that the mind is having a positive emotional response to the Dhamma. That's the important thing there. So this is good. This is what this sutta is talking about. Yeah, that Dhammaveda, Attaveda, that joy and delight in listening to the Dhamma, and that which is a basis for meditation, a basis for developing Brahma viharas. Okay. Okay, so from Joni, so when speaking of hunger and food sources, it is an illness that can be cured in a mostly simple way by providing food. Would this relate to your comment about food, the cure being really easily conquered? I'm not sure if this question relates to the sutta. I think I get what you're pointing to there. You know, the thing with hunger is that you don't really notice it until you can't get anything to eat. And then when you're put into an environment where your meal might not be coming, then you're reminded of it very, very quickly. And, you know, as a monk, as a mendicant, you have less food security than most people do because, well, that's it. You just have your food that you get for today. And living here in Harris Park, every day I go for Pindabata, I go for arms round. I just finished arms round and cleaning up and so on just before this class. And I've been doing this for nearly 30 years now. And every day you don't know if there's going to be something there. I mean, there is, but you don't know that there will be. And I think it's really, to me, that's an incredibly powerful part of that spiritual life. Just that there's a big difference between just taking whatever is offered, if anything is offered, and just the ability to get whatever you want whenever you want it. I can't help feeling like when, as our technologies are becoming more adept, we are reducing that gap between wanting something and having it, which I'm not sure is a good thing. Anyway. So Sume says that utterance is so different from that said by Kondanyo. So that's correct, yes. So you're referring to whatever has a beginning also has an end. Yang kinchi samudaya dhammang sabantang nirodha dhammang, which is spoken by Kondanya in the first discourse, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So these things like expressions of stream entry, arahantship, and so on, they can be expressed in a number of different ways. But also, Kondanya's expression was more an expression of like this is the realization that he's having. He's having this realization that all things arise and all things cease. Whereas the one that's expressed here is more about a more kind of a later reflection about where he is on the path and about where the path still needs to lead. Okay. Fine.
Bante.
Yes.
Hi, Sumi here. Sumi
hi,
here. Yeah, I was referring to the statement that this after the 4 Brahma Vihara meditation, and then the Savaka Sangha understand this. This is it. There is better than this. There is worse than this. Yeah. What is the difference between this and Kondanya's statement? I know that that is their personal realization, but are they looking at the Dhamma? They realize the Dhamma from a different angle?
No. Well, the way that I would see it is that Kondanya was talking about the actual realization that he had at that time. So he's seeing that everything that arises will also cease. Whereas the realization that's being talked about in this sutta is more talking about a reflection about where they are on the path and about where they've come from and where they're going on the path. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, it's too profound for me.
Okay. So let me break it down for you. So you have. Okay. So you are you cooking dinner tonight? Sorry, Simi, I can't hear you. You're muted. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Yes, plan to.
Yeah, you are cooking. You're planning to cook tonight. What are you going to be cooking, if I may ask?
In the kitchen?
Yeah. Yes. What are you going to be cooking?
What am I? Oh, okay. I heard where. Okay.
What?
Let me
Like, it
see.
doesn't have to be all retail. Some rice. Some
yes.
You'll be doing some rice with some. Okay, so when you cook the rice, then when the rice is done, then you'll know, oh, the rice is done. Yeah. So this is whatever has subject to rising is subject to ceasing. It means this is what has happened, right? The rice has been cooked, the conditions are there, everything is done, and now it's ready to go. Then you reflect, okay, we've got this rice, then we need the veggies, and then we need the tofu, and then we need the something else and something else. And that's what this ati idang ati in the current sutta is. So it's more reflecting about the whole process rather than seeing the specific thing. Does that make sense?
A little bit better.
We've only got a couple of minutes. We're going to have to be moving on. So if that's okay, I just want to get to other people's questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. All right. So regarding bathing in the river, I'll just try to get to everyone's questions quickly before we finish. Regarding bathing in the river, ritual can be the catalyst keeps one's working towards the goal of inner bathing. It can help you stay on the path. Exactly. Yeah. So that, again, the Buddha isn't sort of saying not to do it. He's just pointing out that it has a limited benefit. But it certainly, I mean, ritual does have a number of benefits. But particularly it has a communal benefit. It's something that you do that establishes continuity between past, present, and future, and also between yourself and others by participating in the same kind of action that others had. And the holy river is becoming dirty. Yeah, unfortunately so. Holy rivers around the world tend to be absolutely disgusting. But anyway, so Steve asks about, is it possible to stay longer and have breakout with small groups? I'll tell you what, Steve, why don't you bring that up with Rob and can discuss it. We can discuss it on email later on. I do think it's good to have some discussion sessions. Okay. So Kaz mentions, today's themes reminds me that I need to know myself and will take responsibility for my actions. And thank you to Sati Center for the host, and thank you everyone here for sharing the spiritual time. And a number of other people also expressed their gratitude and thanks for the talk. And I think that's all we have time for today. So I want to thank all of you for attending, and especially to the Sati Center and to Rob for putting this on and bringing us all together. And hopefully we've got something to take away with us for today, and hopefully something to take away in terms of like practicing and understanding our own minds, and understanding that we have, to me, one of the most important things here is that, you know, it is up to us. Like we can clean our own minds. And so rather than making excuses and blaming everybody else, which is very pleasant pastime, but it doesn't actually get you very far on the spiritual journey. So we can purify our own minds and find our own peace and happiness within ourselves. And I just wanted to make one further point on the way that the Buddha related to Sundarika Bharadvaja. So notice how when I want to notice something about the nature of the interaction between the two. The Buddha is teaching. Sundarika is sitting in the audience. So notice that there's a sort of a power dynamic there already, right? The Buddha is the one who's in charge. People have come there to listen to him. Sundarika asks the question, and then the Buddha asks him a question back, right? So the Buddha doesn't say, oh, yeah, this is wrong, or something, but he asks him, oh, what can the river Bahuka do? And so the Buddha is engaging him and valuing and respecting his opinion rather than simply refuting and rebutting him, right? So that's the initial response. Now, then when the Buddha, the next bit is quite subtle. But the Buddha does critique his response, right? But he critiques his response in verse, and the verse was the medium used by the Brahmins. So by adopting verse, which has not been found at all in the sutta so far, the Buddha is speaking their language. Right? He's adopting the Brahmanical ways in order to engage with him in a way that he was familiar with. You know, on the one hand, it shows that the Buddha was capable in that area. So it's a bit kind of showing off, but it's also engaging with him in the idiom that he was familiar with. And so that, I think, gives us just like a little bit of insight into understanding the nature of the way that the Buddha engaged with people when they had different views. All right. Thanks, everybody. May you all be happy. Take care, and see you next week. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu.